Gracias a todos los que participan en cualquier manera en este simposio. A nuestros patrocinadores, por supuesto, principalmente a nuestros 3 socios, Bancomer, Televisa y Conaculta Inba. Y sobre todo a ustedes por estar aquí, porque si no hay público, nada de esto tiene ningún sentido. A los ponentes, porque los ponentes vienen realmente por buena voluntad, o sea, les agradezco a todos y cada uno de ellos su tiempo y a todos los que hacen esto posible. Es imposible que yo les lea en este momento 123 nombres, pero están todos mencionados en el programa de mano. Entonces, ustedes saben quiénes son. Muchísimas gracias. A nuestro equipo de traducción, muchísimas gracias. Y hay 2 personas a las que sí quiero mencionar. Una de ellas es Lucía Álvarez, que seguramente ni siquiera está aquí porque es la coordinadora este año del SITAC. Y sobre todo a Patricia Sloan, que no sé si está aquí, pero que para ella sí les pido por favor un aplauso. Y bueno, por supuesto a Pablo Helguera, porque sin su coordinación y sin su manera tan persuasiva que tiene de traernos a todas estas personas, esto no hubiera sido posible. Muchísimas gracias, Pablo. Por último, un comercial. Las memorias del año pasado están a la venta en el lobby, cuestan 100 pesos y con esa aportación podemos hacer las memorias de este SITAC, que estarán listas el año que entra. O cualquier informe que tengan acerca de este SITAC, por favor diríjanse al Patronato de Arte Contemporáneo. Muchísimas gracias por su presencia. Bueno, sí, también a toda la gente del Teatro de los Insurgentes que son tan amables con nosotros cada año. Gracias.
Buenos días. Bueno, voy a introducir muy brevemente la mesa de hoy, que es la segunda parte de la que tuvimos oportunidad de ver ayer, que se titulaba Historia contra Historias, y el subtítulo es Historia y Política. Creo que es bastante obvio que, desde el subtítulo la mesa plantea un poco la necesidad de contrarrestar el desarrollo y la instrumentación de la historia hegemónica a partir del rescate o a partir de la revalorización de una serie de residuos, una serie de fragmentos que con frecuencia se quedan como digamos, olvidados o descartados dentro de las narrativas oficiales. Bueno, supongo que ya saben todos, tuvieron oportunidad de checar el programa. Hoy nos iba a acompañar Henry Sala en esta mesa, lamentablemente no pudo venir, pero es decir, Robert Storr va a hablar más adelante de la obra de Henry, pero quisiera nada más mencionar una de las piezas de Henry que creo que es importante para cómo se va a desarrollar esta mesa, en el sentido que, en años recientes creo que es bastante evidente que ha habido una multiplicación de las propuestas y de las estrategias que pretenden un poco revisar todo, no solo el sentido unívoco de la historia, sino las maneras en que se construye. Ayer Alex Alberro mencionó Dial History, creo que hay muchos ejemplos que podemos dar, el Atlas Group sería otro, y creo que lo interesante de esto es decir también cómo un poco el carácter, digamos, documental y sobre todo la visión objetiva que supuestamente puede llevar un carácter documental ha sido cuestionado. La pieza de Henry que veremos más adelante se llama Intervista y es justamente, bueno, ya hablará Robert más adelante, pero es realmente un poco cómo rescatar justamente estos fragmentos y contraponer de alguna manera las crónicas de la historia contra los relatos que puede generar la memoria y señalar como los vacíos y desfases que se pueden crear entre eso. Robert Storr va a empezar a hablar y su ponencia va a vertir un poco sobre justamente la recuperación de todo este tipo de narrativas después de que hubo algún tipo de cancelación de los discursos históricos, algún tipo de cancelación de las narrativas que daban sentido a todo esto, como ahora había una recuperación de todo este tipo de estrategias a partir de la obra de distintos artistas. Y por otro lado, Pablo, si Robert hablara un poco, digamos, de estrategias artísticas, Pablo abordará otro tipo de herramientas que se pueden utilizar justamente para tratar de contrarrestar este tipo de historias hegemónicas y demás desde una posición mucho más marginal. Bueno, Robert Storr, que está aquí a mi izquierda, es profesor de la Cátedra Solo de Arte Moderno en el Instituto de Bellas Artes de la Universidad de Nueva York. Fue curador del Departamento de Pintura y Escultura del MoMA entre 1990 y 2002 y organizó numerosas exposiciones, entre ellas las retrospectivas de Gerhard Richter, Chuck Close, Tony Smith, y coordinó la serie de proyectos desde 1990 hasta el 2000. Fue uno de los curadores de la retrospectiva de Max Beckmann que se presentó en el 2003 en el Tate Modern y en el MoMA en Queens, y más recientemente organizó la quinta Bienal de Site Santa Fe.
Are we going to do the tape of Henri Sada first or not?
I think Pablo was saying maybe later.
Okay, fine.
As you wish.
Okay, fine. That's fine. Okay. I just didn't understand all that. First of all, I would like to apologize for not doing this in Spanish. I understand a fair amount and read better, but I would hurt your language irreparably if I tried to speak it. Also, I have a tendency to talk very fast, and I have a good deal to say, so I'll apologize in advance to the translators and hope that the gist of what I have to say comes through. About 10 years ago, I did an interview with Felix González Torres. Actually, I did a couple, but in one we talked about the whole question of history and so on in relation to contemporary art, and he said, we have an explosion of information, but an implosion of meaning. It's like Casablanca, where Humphrey Bogart says to Ingrid Bergman, long ago last night. People don't remember last night. I think that's a wonderfully Felixian way and concise way of describing an actual phenomenon. That forgetfulness is, in fact, almost enforced by the way in which we are smothered with information. It is, in fact, in some cases designed to be the product of that surfeit of information, and that the historical consciousness that people might have, or that they do have, but at a subconscious level, is increasingly precarious, increasingly compromised, if you will, by a host of factors, even as large-scale cliches about history are all around us. And I would note the recent address of President Bush. A factoid, and on the absurd side. Prince Harry of England, not exactly a royal skinhead, recently got into trouble for wearing a Nazi uniform to a party. Part stupidity, part proof that his family is genetically unqualified for the job. It is a host of many things, but it also represents a genuine state of consciousness in a large part of the population part of the population, and one should, in a sense, take it seriously symptomatically, because in what he was doing was not so much endorsing fascism as responding to the allure, the perennial allure of fascist style. Stripped of all of its content, all of its historical content, it is in fact one of the most enduring styles that one can think of in the modern era. One might usefully compare communism and fascism on only the level of uniforms and a variety of other aspects of party decor, obviously post the avant-garde period, and say that fascism has survived very, very well indeed because it had very, very good designers. Under other circumstances, perhaps we would see skinhead gangs wearing other kinds of uniforms. Now, in the tabloids, there was, again, great hand-wringing about the fact that he said this and how anybody could have said this of his age. But some clever Brit did a poll, an opinion poll, and found out that of the entire British population, only 40% of the people knew what Auschwitz was, or at least could say in any detail what it was, other than the recognition of the name. That's a pretty extraordinary statistic, since probably no general category of history has been more publicized than the Holocaust in the aggregate, and no name is more representative of that Holocaust than Auschwitz. What is happening indeed is that people are taking in loads of information which registers only perhaps as disconnected signs and symbols or sounds. And in the meantime, as I say, they also take in other things like the styling. So that one can simultaneously, like Prince Harry, think it's cute and actually rather chic to wear epaulettes and a Nazi armband without any malice of intent, although somebody also pointed out that this particular party was dedicated to the colonials. It was a colonial ball of a particular fraternity, which is probably even more overtly offensive than the uniform, since that they could not have missed. This style, again, is everywhere. And it recuperates in a very peculiar way an awful lot of what is probably well-intentioned efforts to educate people to history. From films like Sophie's Choice and Schindler's List, there have been all kinds of effort by the film industry to somehow dramatize, create narratives with characters that are in 3 dimensions, or at least maybe 1.5 to 2, to tell people what it was like. But the styling of those films is so extreme, the aestheticization of the Holocaust is so extreme, that sooner or later the cast of characters ends up more or less like Piotr Oslansky's long catalog of Nazi uniformed officers from different films, where again it is a style that is amusing and leveling and averaging at the same time. I think part of the problem of those films and part of the problem of a great deal of the literature, and I'm not going to stay with the Holocaust much longer, but the literature Holocaust raises a whole set of issues that are germane to the way in which history is generally speaking dealt with in this culture, particularly history of the generation of the fathers and the mothers, as opposed to very distant history. Which is to say, it's built on the notion that it is the direct testimony of those who lived it that should dominate and in some way should be made dramatic again, poetic, what have you, rather than recognizing the intense Oedipal dynamic involved in this all along. Again, Prince Harry's gesture was to spite his parents as much as anything else. That built into any account of past historical disasters, or occasionally there are some past historical reasons to be proud, is the manner of trying in some way to identify the subjectivity of those people to whom you are supposedly conveying this information, rather than having it rely entirely on the subjectivity of the person who lived it and who is trying to convey it. It is interesting also questions of medium, because film is one medium, and Henri Sala's film, which we'll see, is a very particular use, and I think a very creative use of film. But most of the film that we see about historical events follows utterly predictable historical conventions and film conventions. But there are other mediums that have been effectively used, much more effectively used, to speak to younger audiences. In terms of the Holocaust, probably the single most effective one is Art Spiegelman's 2-volume book, Mouse, where he took comic books, the very name itself suggests that the subject would be inappropriate, and created a narrative of Auschwitz, described his experience of being the son of a survivor, and then made the central dynamic of the book not just describing what the Holocaust was, but describing his profoundly ambivalent relationships towards his parents, his sense of the burden of this knowledge, of the resentment of the father who in one case would explain and in another case would not, his ambivalence about his mother who committed suicide, his whole awareness of his father, the victim's own racism towards black people, and so that the whole constellation of questions around which the Holocaust itself centers were relocated in the present in the voice of somebody who was near to, if not identical with, the reader in age and historical experience, and out of which all the connections and all the complications could be teased. In other words, anything but a simple moralizing linear narrative of events. I would say that, in fact, insofar as people attempt to do standard narrative histories of some kind or another, and by standard I only mean in the sense that they move forward more or less directionally, the comic books have turned out to be the medium of choice for some of the most interesting experiments. Here in Mexico, Rius, who did Los Agachados, did in the 1970s, history of the Cuban Revolution, which I remember vividly as one of the first examples that I saw in any case. In Canada, recently, an artist has done the story of Louis Riel, who was a renegade maverick character who was executed by the state, so to speak, and is one of the basic legends of early Canadian history. And you find also Joe Sacco, who has recently done comic books on Palestine, on the war in Yugoslavia or the former Yugoslavia, and so on. So one of the questions then is, in what medium do you communicate, and how do you represent to other generations these things, rather than putting them in the position of simply signing up for the established conventions of the generation, if you will, to whom it happened? Now, there are a set of other complications here, and I'm going to race through them. Among them are, in terms of the visual arts, and that's what I'll concentrate on, a series of taboos. One of those taboos has to do with North American formalism, and another one has to do with certain modernist ideas of the avant-garde in general. In North American formalism, the emphasis was, in fact, to get away as far as possible from any attempt to narrate anything, from any art that was in any sense whatsoever didactic, indeed involving illusionism, representation, and so on. That formal logic very neatly illuminates a whole set of classifications of art without actually addressing the question of what is lost in the process, and without allowing for an argument about whether or not these forms might coexist in certain ways and not be deemed antithetical categorically. The avant-garde notion adds to that, of course, in a whole host of other ways, which I won't go into, but I think should be sufficiently obvious. So that forgetfulness is encouraged by the idea that you're moving forward in the progress of aesthetic time that allows you, in fact, to forget. And the most simple case, and the most obvious one in speaking here, is the way in which the entire Mexican contribution to Jackson Pollock was diminished, if not entirely eliminated, in explanations of how Pollock became Pollock. Now, second set of issues, and I will just, I don't know if I'm even doing very many slides at all, because I don't think I have the time. A second set of issues comes up with how you make these representations and what the viewer's experience of particular photographs, particular films, particular drawings, particular paintings is. There is a recent book by Susan Sontag, which I do not agree with altogether, but is interesting nonetheless, where she talks about the representation of cruel to the other. And of course, it has on its cover an image of from the disasters of War of Goya, and she talks about all the complicated moral and cultural and political implications of representing violence, of voyeurism, of latent sadism, of the objectification of the victim, and so on and so forth. And one of the things she says here is that the tendency is, after a certain period of time, that people remember the photograph, but they do not remember the thing that the photograph represents. That in fact, certain kinds of image making crystallize moments. Then those crystallized moments are relocated into aesthetic contexts, and those aesthetic contexts become increasingly, if you will, muffled in relation to what anybody might actually bring into that space. And that finally, what you see is a beautiful, beautiful photograph of a horrible, horrible thing about which you cannot recall any significant details. I think she's right about this. I think that criticism of the way in which, for example, Robert Capa's famous photograph of a soldier in the Civil War dying on a hill, or the woman or young woman, girl, running with napalm on her back through this, on a road in Vietnam, had become, in a sense, detached from their context. Now, if you take that as the terminal state of all of these arguments, then we're stuck, basically. If you take it another way around and say that you begin now with the fact of enforced forgetfulness in the culture at large, and you begin with the fact that there is this tendency for images to become emblematic and then exclusive of their content almost, you raise another set of possibilities, I see, frankly, as opportunities. And the artists who are dealing with this kind of material now are representing the first serious cluster of artists working in this area that we have seen in a long, long time. It is indeed, by and large, although not exclusively, a generation of artists who are precisely rebelling against restrictive notions of avant-garde progress towards the elimination of imagery, the elimination of narrative, the elimination of this and that, or simply they're shrugging them off. They're not even arguing with them. They're just simply saying, I have a reason to do this, and this is how I will do it. there is an understanding that they have also gained, both through their own experience and their, frankly, I would say their own genius, but also through the long-term effects of critical discourse, which now I think in many ways has done the work that it can do, but we are also beginning to see the fruits in the positive sense, and that is that they are acutely aware that in going into the area of narrative, you must be wary of not creating the new master narrative. On the other hand, they are aware simultaneously, and this is why I think critique has in some ways run its course, endlessly disputing the previous master narrative does not in fact create alternative understandings. It only challenges an existent one, and in a curious reverse way empowers it by saying it is still dominant in cases where it may already have radically cracked. What these artists are doing is taking details of narrative and slipping into those cracks, which simultaneously widen the rupture that exists in the monolithic version, and secondarily demonstrates that one can be, if you will, polyphonic or polyvocal, polymorphous perverse even in some cases, and create multiple overlaid conflicting narratives, in which case you redeem the possibility of narrative forms without necessarily falling into the category of insisting on the fact that your narrative is the one ultimately synthetic one. I was going to show you a bunch of slides, and as I say, I will skip it, but I will give you reference to some of them. One of the places where this has happened the most is in Germany, and for very obvious reasons was connected to what I said before, that if on the one hand you have Art Spiegelman narrating the story of the Holocaust through his father and from his father, on the other hand you have a host of German artists, some of whom lived the war, some of them who remember it in some minor detail as a part of their lives, and others who did not live the war, but who, first of all, had to find out about it from somebody, and sometimes had to find out that they would not find out about it from their families or from the state. That Hans Haacke, who talked yesterday, has dealt with this, particularly the installation in Venice. That Anselm Kiefer has dealt with this in many, many paintings. Beuys both did deal with it and didn't deal with it in ways were extremely problematic, but still lastingly rich in ways of thinking. And you can go on down the list. An artist who, by the way, I would have done the slides, an artist who I like very much, who is not very popular these days, Jörg Immendorf, has also dealt with it. And it would be interesting to make a comparison between Immendorf's painting, for example, and some of Gabriel Orozco's painting, where literally symbols clash, where you have pictures full of emblems of ideologies in tense relationships with each other, and forcefully stated each one of them, so that it capitalizes on the irresoluble residue of this kind of historical drama. Gerhard Richter, with whom I've worked, is one of the chief people in this category. And as I said, if you look at the ambivalence in the case of Spiegelman, you find the same thing in the case of Richter. Richter, who has made paintings, and made them in the 1960s, by the way, when there was virtually no art about the Holocaust that wasn't memorial or ideological in overt ways being made in Germany. Where he made paintings, 3 paintings in particular, actually there's a 4th one which counts. One is a picture of his Uncle Rudy smiling in a Nazi uniform. One is a picture of himself with his aunt. He's on a sort of bearskin rug and she's hovering over him. One is a picture of a man named Dr. Heide being shadowed by a police officer. And the 3rd one is a family photograph of a group of people gathered together under the paternal gaze of a single man who smiles down. The first picture is the picture of the young Nazi officer in many, if not most, German families. If you will, the picture that you had in your family album at the end of the war, as well as at the beginning of the war, but about which all the meanings had changed over that time. The second is a picture of his aunt who was killed in the pilot project for the Holocaust called T4, which was the euthanasia program used to kill people who were mentally retarded or psychologically ill or otherwise frail. And the third picture is the picture of the doctor who killed her, Dr. Heide, who ran this program. And the fourth picture actually is a family photograph, the content of which has only recently become apparent, but it's Richter's father-in-law, who it turns out also was involved in the T4 program. So he had married into a family where the person who killed his aunt was in a sense represented. And this represents 4 different positions for one subjectivity of one young man surviving the war, looking in all directions. In other words, rather than making historical art about the correct position to take, it was about the position in which one was put by circumstance, by history. Similar kinds of things have been done by other people. In the Eastern Bloc, a lot has come out. Or I should say not even in the Eastern Bloc, but also within the whole socialist communist world. There's been a very interesting, I think, quiet exchange of experience between Tanya Bruguera and Marina Abramovich, since both grew up in these societies, both grew up within the heart of these societies, not at its periphery. But one particular example I would give you is the work of Ilya Kabakov, who, although he's been working since the 1960s, he's been known in the West, really has been known outside of a small circle of friends in Moscow for only about 17 years. Kabakov demonstrates that there are other mediums appropriate to this than painting. I already suggested comic books as one. Another one, of course, is film. But he has shown that installational art is a way of creating narratives in which the viewer is also participant creator of meaning, where you explore a space and find the clues that describe a complex reality, but that the subjectivity of understanding history is enhanced or, in fact, predicated upon the fact that you, as the reader, will choose something that some other reader chooses second, and that you will move to third, and when they move to something else, fourth, and that there is in fact no possible definitive reading, partly because the very nature of narrative in sequencing cannot be replicated and undone once it's begun. In other words, that there are no medium specificities to this, but specific opportunities in a variety of mediums. And in the case of Kabakov, he is playing both of the roles I've described. He is simultaneously making installations that would show to a young Russian who did not grow up in the Soviet period what it was like. And he is also going, for example, through the narratives that his mother told him, like Art Spiegelman, to recuperate those parts of that experience that he himself did not have. If you have the narrative function of in medias res, this is sort of in medias place or something like that. There are a host of others who, again, has done this herself. But it's interesting that in the piece she talked about this afternoon, or this morning, wherever we are, she talked a great deal about the present, living in the present. That is one of the basic tenets of contemporary art, has been since Cage, and she showed a quote of Cage's early on. This is one of the aspirations, is to live absolutely in the present, to not, in a sense, endure the nightmare that is history, according to Joyce, those his words, to not endure that, but to be freed of those contradictions which have imprisoned people, and to start fresh. That is a primary impulse which I respect enormously. But then, she said, and then I wore the shoes that I wore on the Great Wall of China. And then I wore a jacket that was based on Rodchenko. And in the most direct kind of way, which is not just stylistic, clearly, she showed that in every case where one is in the present, one lives with the past. Now, historical art which wants to live in the past is, in my view, ipso facto, bad news. Not news, by the way, also. But this other factor, this dynamic or dialectic back between an intense desire to be here, as we are now, and at the same time to understand that all of this material is there already in part, and that that which is not there is our job to go back and find, and that which is there is our job to constantly rethink, is the task at hand, and is the task that, remarkably enough, after 2 generations of scorning historically based art, is being picked up by a lot of people in their 20s, 30s, and 40s. Thank you.
Voy a ceder la palabra a Paulo Herkenhoff. Él es historiador del arte y curador. Actualmente es el director del Museo de Bellas Artes de Río de Janeiro y anteriormente se desempeñó como curador asociado de pintura y escultura del Museo de Arte Moderno también en Nueva York, y como director, y fue el director artístico de la 25 edición de la Bienal de Sao Paulo.
Yo quisiera agradecer la invitación para hablar en México a Pablo Helguera y todos los que han participado en la organización y pedirles excusa por no hablar en español porque yo hablo un portuñol con un acento lunfardo. Entonces, esto es terrible. Y al mismo tiempo decirle que hablaré de toda forma en una lengua extranjera, que es el inglés. I titled my talk today, Take Away the Center and You Have the Universe. Gregory Babcock opened his preface to Minimal Art, a Critical Anthology in 1968 by arguing that Matthias Goeritz from Mexico cannot be considered a minimalist. Babcock's book was the first major publication on minimalism. Two nationalistic strategies have dominated the early literature on minimalism in the United States as complementary approaches to a game of cultural hegemony. The first is the exclusion or downgrading of any possible precedent to minimalism outside of the United States. Part of the responsibilities and burdens of coming from a non-hegemonic culture like Brazil is to defend it against geopolitical process of exclusion and hierarchization of culture. I speak from the point of view of one living in Brazil, living in Rio de Janeiro, and from the curatorial experiences in Curitiba, the Bienal of São Paulo, and MoMA. At this point, I would say that in a way, working like that is working within a semiotic war, as Todorov has described certain experiences. Anthropophagy is about incorporation of the other, negotiation and exchange, metabolization of differences, acceptance. Thus, the Bienal of São Paulo could not be a one curator show like Documenta. It was a collective process. At this point, I would like to dedicate this talk, if it has any sense, to 4 people that are today in the audience and have taken part in that experience, which are Silvia Pandolfi, Don Ades, Rob Storr, and Tobias Oberländer. It is, however, irrelevant if Babcock understood or not Goeritz. He vomited him. Levi-Strauss considered that societies can be metabolizing of difference, like anthropophagic societies, or they can refuse, vomit, anthropoemic societies. This is not the case of the United States, but maybe it's the case of that specific Babcock's paragraph. His clear needs to exclude right from the beginning a non-US artist so as to define the American origin of minimalism. That's his true meaning. Once this is safeguarded, the absurd is the inclusion of major artists from other contexts in the catch-all minimalist cage. Now the example, for instance, Kenneth Baker putting arte povera inside minimalism, art of circumstances, and thus having to ignore Fontana and Manzoni. Minimalism has been used as a tool of US cultural imperialism to manipulate differences and to expand its influence zone. Seeking the least common denominator, it reduces any achievements to a US standard with the erasure of cultural contests, specific programs, and different histories. This is ethnocentric art history that takes culture of a given hegemonic economy as the universal rule. It's a factory of opacity. It applies bias values and inadequate methodology. It ignores the specificity of other movements, artists, and works. It denies both difference and the possibility of other histories. It then invents models of qualities and the ultimate truth. The contemporary process of international exchange still demands a development of strategies in order to rewrite history, departing from the margins and cultural differences, curating or other ways of challenging the systems of hierarchy and centralizations of contemporary history somehow is the challenge of many of us who are here today. This is what I call the laws of ethnocentric history, trying to raise some of them. Let me describe you a performance by Lígia Pape. The curtain parts. At center stage stand monochromatically painted rectangular and cylindrical columns, several feet high. Nothing else is on the stage. For some time, nothing happens. No one enters or leaves. Then, suddenly, the columns moves. To all appearances, the minimalist Robert Morris had not attended the Ballet Concreto by Lígia Pape in Rio in 1958, before doing his columns performance in 1961. Yet, my narrative of Pape's work paraphrases Rosalind Krauss's descriptions of Morris' performance, mechanical ballet, light, motion, and theater in her text. So it required very little adaptation of Pape's ballet. In a short moment, which I call The Marriage of Reason and Squalor, I confronted a painting by Frank Stella of 59 with a print, the Cellar print of Lígia Pape of 58. They bear formal resemblance and many issues of organic space. I also stressed in the Cisneros conference at Harvard in 2001 that in principle, since both Stella and Morris are North Americans, they should be beyond suspicion of succumbing to the influence of a South American artist. Had the situation been reversed, Pape would have been considered derivative of the North American minimalist artist. This is still a prevailing law of modern art historicism. There is a general need nowadays to reconsider the role of minimalism, to find the value of its aesthetics for itself, but not as the epitome of modernism that affects artists in every other post-war movement almost everywhere in the world. In the recent symposium, Structures and System, an Intercontinental Art World at the Get in 2004, also Yves Alain Bois made the same exercise I did here to demonstrate precedence in the French painters like Morellet to the work of Stella. If we think that Pape belongs to neo-concretism, which was consistently articulated in 58, while minimalism was more of a dispersed tendency that flourished mainly in the 60s, we could enter certain discussions, but this is not the case here. I do not think that neo-concretism influenced minimalists. It's enough that is recognized. Minimalism, however, was politically reduced to a tool of American cultural imperialism. Pop art promoted freedom of expression and consumerism as promised by capitalism in the Cold War. Under globalization, minimalism is the tentacular formalism that is both everything and nothing. It is the most adequate strategy for the post-Soviet era, offering the neutrality for the Pax Americana in a world that lacks alternative political thought. But this is a losing game for minimalism as aesthetics. To encompass everything, it has to give up the cultural specificity. My next issue comes from that is how there is an effort of overcoming cultural dependence and finding artistic autonomy in some South American countries. In his Mexican period, Trotsky has observed that in Latin America, modernism was understood as a strategy designed to overcome the colonial past. For many artists, this modern effort toward autonomous language in South America resulted only in securing a marginal place for themselves in the hegemonic history of art. Since the 1950s, critics and artists in Brazil struggled to escape from cultural dependence. The challenge proposed by art critics like Mário Pedrosa, Ferreira Goulart, the poet Haroldo de Campos, the filmmaker Glauber Rocha, artists like Aléjate and Arthur Barrio, resulted in the development of an autonomous artistic language and theory within the established political and fragile economic conditions of the then called Third World. First Pedrosa and later Goulart, they introduced a new consciousness of art history. It should not be seen as an evolution of styles, movements, or a set of images in an endless succession of models, but a legacy of visual problems to be taken up. Paradigms were not to be repeated in derivative ways, but they were the point from which an artist should start to develop his or her own issues. The works of Clark and Oiticica, for instance, they depart at the ultimate point from which Mondrian and Malevich maybe could not have solved their own problems, visual problems, plastic problems. From this perspective, it was clear that despite the political dominances of the artistic system in such cities as Paris and New York in the international art world, and the impact of certain artistic movements, such as pop art and minimalism, the world could become centerless for that creative minds. Pedrosa observed in 1966 that we are no longer operating within the parameter of the so-called modern art. I suggest we use the expression postmodern to signify the differences. He prematurely coined the notion of postmodernity when he understood that the original and unprecedented cultural experience of modernity had been consummated. Pedrosa also confronted the historical conditions of creative works in advanced capitalist economies with those of third world, pre-capitalist countries, and also with the Soviet economic system countries and area. He reviewed artistic output within the context of mass production, called the attention for the way in which monopolist capitalism could condition the artist's work. Haroldo de Campos, in his turn, he argued with Marx and Engels against the mechanicist reduction and self-punishing fatalism that thought that every economically developed country is bound to produce nothing but underdeveloped culture. So he's questioned that. He stated that difference is foundational in autonomous artistic language. Goulart made a contribution with his book Avant-Garde and Development, in which he makes a crucial question. Is there in the underdeveloped countries a specific angle from which one sees history? This is Goulart's crucial inquiry on the possibility of inverting Eurocentric paradigms. I then discuss the place of curators in the comfortable hammock of ideology. Let's take the cliché object of the hammock in which the bias put all us indolent Latin Americans. In his Amazon triptych, José Alejandro Restrepo gives a critical perspective to a trivial fact. A man finds difficulty in leaving a hammock. This is not about physical impairment or cultural maladjustment to hammocks. The man acts as if caught by the viscous spider web. The metaphor is the prison veil of ideology The challenge is leaving the webs without tearing it, and the only way you can do it is through the use of knowledge. Then the term ideology is more than a system of ideas. It comprises, of course, a system of power and interest of dominant groups. For Gramsci, ideology is a system of subtleties, control, and manipulation. Does this sound familiar in a discussion about art? Gramsci argued that society was moved forward by the struggle between the ruling class and the subordinate working class. Could we adapt this to the contemporary system that we live in? The role of the intellectual is to create counter-hegemony, he states. He understood that the idea that intellectuals are a distinct social category, both autonomous and independent in the class structure, was a myth. For him, traditional intellectuals might look autonomous and independent, yet they are only conservative allies of the ruling class. The validity of Gramsci's posit is to allow some questions. What are the alliances of an independent and autonomous curator today? This is a question I make myself. Which are his or her alliances in terms of the ruling groups and system in society? Gramsci points out that the organic intellectual has to be a real participant in practical life as a constructor, organizer, and permanent persuader. I would dare to mention here a collector, which is Patricia Cisneros, because in a way, collectors are transformers of financial capital into symbolic capital. And collectors may have a role of organizers of history and not reduce himself to an impact in the market. Patricia Cisneros came to the conclusion that Latin American art deserved a firm recognition and set a plan to pursue this goal. The crucial step was forming a collection with severe discernment and precise sense of history. Her collection became a tool for temporary shows all over and is open to extended launch to museums all over the world. She made a show of the collection at the Fogg Museum, which resulted in a seminar and in a major book, a reference book, which is Geometric Abstraction in Latin American Art, from the Cisneros collection. As a trustee at MoMA, she has donated very strategic Latin American pieces, which now are in the permanent display in the museum. Her support to research, shows, and publication is followed by grants to young curators. She created a travel fund for MoMA curators because she has a certainty, she is sure that being in the region is enough to persuade curators of her own faith. Then, the issue of curatorial exploration in other areas brings me the image of the ideology of the new missionaries. In the last 20 years, the dynamics of museums, the way careers are now developed, and the exhibition programs transformed into a positive factor the introduction of artists unrecognized by the hegemonic international system. Evidently, this is a very important progress as far as political relations are concerned. But a new type of curator has appeared. I call the contemporary missionaries. Artists are rescued from exclusion, become des beaux sauvages. It's an illusion to believe that the mainstream perverse mechanism of hierarchy does not repeat itself internally in peripheral economy. This may impair the good curator, the good soul of the curator, to become a real agent of history. The paternalizing missionaries look like an innovative organic curator or critic in the international level. for their good deeds against the mainstream international ideology. However, they might be acting in the reverse upon the local native scenes of the Beau Sauvage. Missionaries might be picking from the local mainstream and reinforcing its games of internal hegemony. They become ideologically trapped there within the local dominating structures. Now, with a broken heart, I will speak about a man that was crucial to the international recognition of Brazilian art and Latin American art, who is Guy Brett. Since the 98s, this has been a danger lived by Guy Brett, who historically, as I said, was basically in this recognition of Latin American modernism. Brett today is falling to recognize the result of his alliance within the powerful formalist Greenbergian cycle that gravitated around Sérgio Camargo in Brazil. Some of Brett's alliances in the 90s are firmly today engaged in the deconstruction of the meaning of Clark and Oiticica to Brazilian culture, and Brett was the major international curator to recognize those two artists. So, being the missionary, an occasional visitor, he or she may be unnoticeably become a conservative intellectual in local terms. Because of time, I will jump and I will briefly discuss the issue of a collective memory. It's impossible to forget. We may block, but it's impossible to forget. What is impossible to forget? It could be answered also by the return of the repressed. Freud says that traumatized experience of childhood constitutes the primal scene. And I think to make a connection with Storr's discourse on Varejão and Walker, that they too develop a parameter of the primal scene. And this is taken from history and involves subjectivity and identity plus ethnic origin. They refer to what Jacques Derrida called the anthropological war. Varejão and Walker are agents of collective memory. In some paintings, Varejão reconstructs an imaginary scene of the origins of Brazil. She utilizes male portrait by 19th century Jean-Baptiste Debré to create violent scenes with women. She articulates a fabric of partial histories: art history, the history of knowledge, history of cultural exchange, history of the colonial body. Walker creates the primal scene through a multitude of characters, exposing opaque history of violence against women and African Americans. Walker called them an undetermined number of schizophrenic voices. The shifting logic among the personages recount frictions of history and violence, the failures of progressivism and brutality of the norm. To go closer to finishing, I would say that history is now. And when I organized the show Tempo, which was maybe the main reason why Pablo invited me at MoMA, it should necessarily involve post-September 11, 2001 production in the show. The terrorist attack with the fall of the Twin Towers was the most visible event in the history of mankind. Tempo had to open on June 2002, had to respond to this unavoidable history. The challenge was, however, to avoid opportunistic works or ordinary images. In a time of grief and fast-moving history, by 2002, the fall of World Trade Center could be overexposed. The strategy was to displace the issue in time to a history prior to the historical event and in space to Afghanistan. Inigo Maglanovai's installation, Nocturne, commissioned for Tempo, was related to the then recent Afghanistan war. The artist used complex optical devices, such as military lens night vision, to bring into light the discussion of the darkness visible, a reference to Milton's Paradise Lost. From the flames of hell comes no light, but rather darkness visible. The tulip in his work is the transiency of flowers that soon become heroin, a major economic activity of Afghanistan. The artist brings visibility to what is hidden in games of power, mastering the knowledge of facts in the opaque and greenish conflation of news and history, optics and war. Nadine Robinson presented a sound installation which used the music of Texan black prison inmates who sing a war chant to bear their unbearable suffering under the yoke of heavy forced labor. In Tower Holder, she brings our collective fate of generations of African American, endlessly limited by past and present class and ethnic discrimination. The installation, which relates music and labor, was considering during her work in a studio program in 1999 at the World Trade Center. Originally, she was to deal with an acceptable working condition of African Americans and Latino immigrants in the 455 tenant firms that occupied the building at the World Trade Center. Robinson and Maglanovai did not deal mainly with the innocent victims of terrorism. Instead, they dealt with pre- and post-September victims, and maybe a double victims, which were those undocumented workers working there. Their dialectical position did not abandon the World Trade Center, also as a symbol of contradictions of capitalism and democracy. Therefore, maybe the choice of the two works means that the show Tempo was a necessary, planned, curatorial failure in the wake of the Bush era. And to finish, I would quote an artist from the United States. The effort of an artist to fulfill with his or her task as an agent of history find a synthesis with David Hammond's. I take the responsibility. That's it.
Bueno, antes de que pongamos un fragmento del video de Henry, quisiera nada más comentar un poco como en relación a las dos ponencias y también quizás en relación un poco a las mesas anteriores que tuvimos la oportunidad de escuchar. Es decir, creo que es como muy claro que quizás la amnesia puede presentarse casi como la otra cara de la historia. Y creo que una palabra que ha estado como de alguna manera muy presente en todas las ponencias y que me gustaría retomar, quizás creo que la pudieran, no sé si puedan comentar cada quien algo acerca de ello, es la palabra de sitio específico en relación a todo esto. Es decir, en la primera mesa, cuando hablaban Cuauhtémoc y Thierry, que se debatía un poco, es decir, hasta qué punto debería, digamos, el crítico de imponer su visión sobre la obra. Me acordé de una frase de Andrea Fraser, que también después se discutió su obra, en la que sugería, me parece que fue en una entrevista contigo, sugería la posibilidad de hacer crítica de sitio específico. Por otra parte, Hans Hacke ayer también mencionó la importancia de considerar una historia de sitio específico para su obra. Bueno, creo que la plática de Marina fue como muy importante en ese sentido, sobre todo en la relación con el público. Y ahora, bueno, tú mencionabas que no es todas estas manifestaciones que se han estado haciendo no son específicas a un medio, sino justamente específicas a determinadas oportunidades. Es decir, creo que todo esto también tiene que ver de alguna manera con, por supuesto, la manera en que se tiene que contextualizar tanto una obra como una exposición en el momento de hacer una curaduría, y cómo se considera el contexto no solo de, digamos, de creación, tanto de la obra o de la curaduría, sino también del contexto en el que se va a insertar en relación a todo este tipo de estructuras de poder. Entonces, digo, no estoy esperando haber sido demasiado largo, pero a lo mejor quisieran comentar algo acerca de esta posibilidad.
Okay. I was trying to do that in Spanish one ear and English the other. I mean, I think the whole question of site specificity is enormously rich in problems and enormously rich, as I tried to say, about other things in opportunities. I think one has to admit that the site is what exactly? The site is a physical place. It is a community which comes. It is a time in which it takes place. It is a time within historical time and a time within a more narrow focus. The site is not one thing, and too often this term has been referenced right back, as Paulo said, to a very specific set of discourses revolving around Richard Serra and some other artists, and it's reduced to a formal category, which is a potent formal category, but hardly the full extent of the situation. But I'll do a little flip. Paintings, by and large, are not site-specific, except those which are in churches or public buildings. The paintings of the Mexican mural movement are not known as well as they should because they are truly site-specific. They not only cannot move, but they're unintelligible unless you see them in their architectural surround, and all of those artists thought very hard about that. But by and large, paintings are portable things. What kind of a site is there in a painting which is 10 years old and about something that's 20 years old as relative to a painting which is 50 years old and about something 100 years old, and as you move back in time? I think the site increasingly transfers to the viewer and transfers to a set of cultural assumptions that surround the viewer, or that the viewer carries with them, or that are embedded in the presentation, the architecture, the commentaries on the walls, if there are any, and so on and so forth. So that the site is a large open term, and I don't think one can get at the essence of that problem by treating them as if they're all roughly equivalent. Having said that, to take Rick analogous in certain ways to what Felix did with his anachronologies, which is to say, the story is constantly recomposed in space and time, the space and time and the space and time of the viewer, even though a pictorial space is not site-specific in a way, phenomenologically, if you will, in most cases, that a sculptural one is, or that a Kabakov one is, and so on and so forth. But the conditions of viewing, the limitations imposed on viewing, are all of them germane, and I think that's where the question starts, but there's no across-the-board answer for how it comes out.
I'll start talking from the perspective of Rob's curatorial work at MoMA. You brought the Bad Meinhof paintings to the museum, no? And also, strategically, you do the show, the Gerhard Richter show, after the MoMA 2000 series of exhibitions. So you bring an artist which is dealing with history, is dealing with the history of the present, and at the same time opens to even the contradictions that Grimbergens put and between formal and style and narrative, etc. So as if that show would be a conclusion, a synthetic problematization of what been the cycle, no? From my point of view, when I was at MoMA, when I arrived there, I had two phrases in my mind by two artists who had taken part at information exhibition, and without any combination, they said, I'm not here representing a country and not a career. So I understood that it was about culture and strategy. I was not there for a career. So the opportunities I had to make a show. The first one was to put a small seed that history could be reviewed and call the attention for the dialogue, the possible dialogue around neo-concretism and minimalism, which was a small show called The Marriage of Reason and Squalor. And of course, the Temple show was like the farewell exhibition, in which also many issues that I had seen in the museum and were my worries, which about time and different representation of time, like collapse of time, time and the body, and symbolization and history, and the idea of a history of eternity from Borges' literature. So it was a melange. Each room was a discussion about the angles of time. But of course, an exhibition is always, or should be, a site-specific intellectual project. And here I'll speak a little bit about Bienal of São Paulo. When I was invited to do the show, I had a few prior ideas. The first one was that I wanted to do a show for Brazil. We did not have, for instance, international press, media, whatever, bureau. We did not invite any person writing a newspaper, magazine from anywhere else. There was not this intention. The show was done for Brazil. And to choose the issue, I asked which would be a major issue that we in Brazil should discuss. And my reasoning there was, if we did it in Minas or Bahia, it could be the Baroque. If it was in Rio, it could be neoclassicism or neoconcretism. Being São Paulo, it should be anthropophagia, which was the main modernist discussion set by the city. So this was the first issue. A show for Brazil to discuss its own history, and a show for São Paulo to understand its heritage and the way it gave to the country. The next worry was that the audience of the Bienal of São Paulo, 40% of the audience of the Bienal of São Paulo is coming for the first time to an art show. This means they have to cross the border of class structure. The building means that, 40%. So the show had to talk to an arch of interest, from those who are being introduced to an art exhibition, up to the scholars. So I was accused, for instance, of using excess of comparisons in the text in the walls, not by a philosopher. But making analogies is, for me, accepting the other, the way the other is, and from that point on, you start. No? On the other hand, the catalog should be a scholarly production. And also, we understood that the Biennale was a triangle, an exhibition, an edition of catalogs of ideas, and education. So we focused on public education. We trained 1,000 teachers in different classes. I gave class to each of the groups. They had 30 hours of classes. We prepared material for 15,000 classrooms, and we brought 200,000 students from the public school system, which in Brazil means the excluded ones. The material was planned in a way that it could be used permanently and be followed permanently. So the material, the Bienal of São Paulo, is still going on as far as the education project is concerned. And it has been used already by 2 million students. because as long as it's there, it can be used. So they were prepared in a way that we did not need to have the Biennale, so the material could use. So I think the aiming society is what made the Biennale really meaningful. And as far as the contribution of the curators, initially there was this idea that I could be forcing curators from major institutions, very important curators, to study some of Brazilian art history. Of course, historians like Don Ads knew already enough, and Rob had the knowledge of the Brazilian system, but there was this idea of bringing the material to the attention of curators from around the world. But in the process, I understood we Brazilians were being cannibalized in the good sense, because the response was, hey, this is not only Brazil, hey, this can be done in another way, with another title. No? So I found that the Biennale was this experience of exchange. And I feel this is the importance of a show in a Latin American country that costed at the time, the dollar and the cruzeiro, they had the same value, 14 million, which meant the cost of 14 schools. So this was also very important.
Could I just add one thing? I think it should be said, and I can say this since I was watching it happen, that the kind of shows that Paulo made rather in MoMA were really misunderstood and not understood. And he did something which in institutional terms was very courageous and did individual exhibitions which were incredibly rich, partly because he brought the fruits of the kind of postmodern discourse which he uses into actual exhibition practice. Having said this, I will also then register a complaint. It was noticeable, and it is also noticeable in other contexts with other curators, that those critics who belong to these discourses, who generated these discourses, who could be the voices on the outside of the institutions to validate curatorial efforts, flawed or otherwise, almost never go to bat for curators who do it. So that what happens is the fixation with the big institutions, and again, with a stalled discourse about where they have stalled, have actually made it harder for curators working within the system to make the changes that are necessary. And Paulo is a prime example.
Bueno, vamos a ver un fragmento del video de Henry Sala entonces y ya abriremos la discusión al público.
Tregoj diçka që kanë gjetur kuptim. Si ku kishte thënë të mia që politikët janë shpjetë.
Wow, kjo është surprizë. Nuk e dija që kishim këtë film. Kjo është historia, fillimi i historisë së ngritjes time në përgjithësi. Wow. No powiem, też to była surpriza, po czym.
Che emozione?
Nu m-am tocat.
Wann uns Spanko ka qenë vite?
Kam si të se, besoj është vitin 1977.
77?
20 vjet më përpara.
Çfarë është?
Kongresi i rinisë.
Sa vjet ishe aty?
Sa vjet jam tani? 52, hiç 20. 32.
E mban që vetëm të kjo intervista?
Jo, do jam kurioze të ndi.
Se në fakt i ka humbur zëri intervistës.
Ka di më vjen keq që pas kam humbur zërin. Nuk e më mand, po... Pushkin, ky është Pushkin Lugonja.
Është këtu?
Besoj që po. Po ç'më nuk më mand që të më ketë intervistuar ndonjëherë.
Alo, mirë dita familja Lugonja. Zotin Pushkin dhe shërë Lugonja. Mirë dita Anëri Sala jam, djali bashkimeve të Salës. Besoj se njihni. Unë studioj për video dhe kam gjetur këtu unë studioj në Paris, po kam gjetur këtu në Tiranë, kam gjetur një intervistë të vjetër të time mëje, të gjithë 70 ca. Edhe në fund fare një që i keni bërë intervistën, dhe desha t'ju takoja në qësë është e mundur për të... Unë kam edhe një kamera me vete, po pastaj flasëm qëse nuk e bezdis, të filmoj 1 minutë. Sepse janë gjitha pjesë të kujtimeve për të realizuar se si gjese unë mundohem gjede tekstin në intervistës. Kjo nuk ka të bëjë me televizionin, kjo më intereson mua në linje në shkollën atje, po kam një detyrë të vogël dhe unë kam zgjedhur këtë nga që gjeta këtë filmin.
2000 intervista zi të them. Intervistuesi kur shkonja e takoja rasti konkret ke vërtet e dinte se çfarë të vështirë. Unë e dija çdo të përgjigje ajo. Dhe telespektatori për një herë në haste se çdo flisë. Sepse pyetjet ishin pothuajse të përcaktuara. Pyetje për përgjigje pozitive.
Se nuk ka zë, nuk kam pas në shpi vetëm figurën dhe zëri ka humbur.
Që s'ka në gjyrë.
Shpimi i bërë në zi.
Ja të që unë të temon për kongres. Që kongresi?
Ne shumë në sekretari parë,
No, ja. Që mund jeti mirë, mund jeti shtatë të vërtetë, ne s'kemi tjenë.
I praje, duhet të them, dalloj pa sekretari parë. Është Helguera, apo l'ultimo Nari, apo Lombardi, apo...
Jepi për piro, jepi.
Lega, po cili shpirva?
Ja, mund të si.
Ai duke pipi mi trejori.
Ku mora pipi?
Prapa fiqeretes, që duhe?
Yes. Kam si.
Domethënë nuk keni qenë në kongresin që kanë.
Jo, ai është kongres që është bërë në kohën kur ne ishim të ndërnuar. Kështu që vetëm nuk ishim, pas e njëm se bëhet një kongres i tillë.
Operatori i zërit, intervistës me zë të humor, po në një kohë dhe taksistin, shoferi që po në ndihmon për të xhiruar në për Tiranë. Po. Si shpjegohet që sot tjetë timon?
Fakti është ky që në fakt unë nuk u largova nga puna, se natyrisht unë kisha 30 sa vjet që punoisha në kinostudio, po thoj se pioneri i kinostudios, po faktikisht unë u largova vetëm për arsye ekonomike, se rroga ishte shumë e vogël. Natyrisht çmimet u ngritën shumë, unë nuk e përballonja dot. Dhe u detyrova, bleva këtë makinën edhe po punoj taksi tash.
Po mirë, si shpjegohet që nuk ka zë intervista?
Intervista nuk ka zë. Se për arsye s'ka zë se ne kur filmonim atëherë nuk ishte në një pistë siç filmohet sot për shembull, siç po filmoni juve, po ishte ndarë, fonograma ishte veç me magnetofonin që zohesh në shirit magnetik, ndërsa filmin e kishte kamera. Kështu që pra ne do të ketë hum ajo.
Qartë, ka humor pjesa e zërit.
Ka hum pjesa e zërit, do të ketë hum patjetër. Atëherë i kisha thjesht frikën teknike, që mos ndodhte një defekt në shirit ose nuk inqizojsha. Kjo ishte frika. Kur intervistoja, natyrisht u heqen ato bëras politike ose tjera. Ndërsa sot është frika e rrugës. Sot për shembull ka dalë një frikë tjetër, për shembull është grabitja. Unë ma mirë preferoj këtë frikë se kjo frika ka një fund e sotshmja. Ndërsa ajo ishte frikë e pafundshme. Sa jetonte njeriu.
ndodhet, s'është absurde. Jo, nuk është e vërtet. Se s'është në asgjë, do të mund është fondë se s'është në asnjë gjë, s'ka asnjë mendim, nuk jam njëri që s'artikuloj dot mendim.
Unë po të them që e kam vërtet shka shumë me mesme, duhet të vetëmi që mund të zbërthejnë dhe unë tani do të lexoj ty titrat dhe ti shit në vizjen e gojës tënde.
E kupton, nuk po flas për planin politik, se s'ka asnjë gjë, s'ka logjik.
Mama shiko, ti shit buzët, përse nuk e takimi, këtë takim ishte shpre, ajo ishte shumë e qartë për arsye se pas parimit të kësaj lufte, fascismi dhe të që realizohet, domosdoshmërisht partisë marksiste leniniste, domosdoshmërisht vetëm sa do shkon të përpjekjen ruajtjen e punës së madhe të partisë marksiste leniniste, vetëm atë do të realizohej me sukses fitoria e këtij lufte. Mos më shumë do fshihet edhe situata aktuale politike, vetëm në kohë pra edhe në vendet e veçanta, për shembull, duke qenë atje, duke diskutuar problemet e situatë, aty s'ke prerje në film.
Po nuk kemi këto fjalë.
Po këto fjalë do ti shih buzët mos lexos ta lexojmë për ty. Kur e ke thënë këtë intervistë? Me çfarë rast?
Mund të jetë sakt që e kam thënë mbas një takimi ndërkombëtar rinie. Kuptohet shumë e qartë. Për revolucionin botëror. Për të bërë të njëjtë gjithë njerëzit e botës të barabartë. Pa shtypje, pa shuzim. Ti nuk bukur në sot, apo jo? Të mos shtypje dhe shuzim njerëzit.
Ishtë besoje në këto gjëra, këto ishin ideale.
Këto pyetje që më bën të ti kanë bërë refestime shumë më parë. Sa është doza e kompromisit në pushtetit, kompromisit në vetën, revoltës?
Po që vetëm ja qelës që më krijote mua aksesi me botën, në këtë botën tënde, është më ishte shkoja shumë në mesa.
Është ironia madhe.
Gjithë të përbashkët. Rastësisht të përbashkët.
Rastësisht të përbashkët kjo është, që ishte një sistem që ishte shumë në moment sepse fliste me një gojë, me një zë. Kjo është, po, është më shumë simbolike, sepse nuk kemi qenë kaq strikt, në ambientet tona ishim më të lirë, edhe ti e di këtë. Edhe mund vjeshën që ke shkruar në vjeç, që ke frikë nga politika, si do arrinje ti të ka konceptonje? Të shbëj një 8 vjeç një vjeç që ti ke frikë nga politika, në që se ambienti i dyzduar në shtëpi nuk të çonte tek ajo gjë. E këto nuk ishte kaq bardhëzi. Kemi jetuar, kemi dashuruar, kemi lindur fëmijë, mendonim se po ndryshkonim botën. Pastaj i humbisnin të tëra, gradualisht. Ne jemi gjenerata që mbajmë peshën e fajt dhe të gabimeve. Ne jemi okej se gjenerata para nesh, sepse gjenerata para nesh e mendon të më të kam shumë ideale, kishim shumë optimizëm, doli nga lufta. Ajo që është pozitive për mua, që vlen për mua, është që unë mund të ndikoj që ti ose brezi që vjen të marri maksimumin e eksperiencës sonë për t'i bërë gjërat më ndryshe. Nuk besoj që po të më kthesh mua në kohë, në retrospektiv, unë do t'i bëj gjërat ndryshe. Sepse kam besuar që i bënja mirë. Këtë mund ta them, kam besuar që i bënja mirë.
Pasar a la sesión de preguntas y respuestas, porque creo que estamos un poco cortos de tiempo. que si...
Mendoj se ka pas disa kategori. Disa që dini mirë, disa që vazhdojnë të ushqim. Që ka bërë nga për hipokrizi. Po I ka besuar atyre idealeve, I ka besuar. Po që zhgënim sepse papritur I shkuam deri në fund këtij pushteti që ne mendonim se po krijonim një shoqëri ideale.
Për shembull, njëri vete në dyqan e peshkut dhe nuk vjen peshk, apo jo edhe shan pushtetin. Tash ati vjen keq s'ka peshk, po nuk mund të thuash se është një element që kërcënon pushtetin me pambesje. Ta marrë me gjitha dhe me merë, e fut brenda. Po pse e këtu brenda martin burgjen? Po se kritikohen në radhën e dyqanit peshkut. Apo edhe kështu u rigjerua, si të thuash, edhe pa drejtësia, u rigjerua shtypja, dhuna, ati edhe kemi qenë kemi jetuar 50 vjet në diktaturë. Edhe diktatura nuk zbulon, po mbulon. Mbulon të keqen. Mbulon krimin. Diktatura nuk u siguron qetësi, po imponon një qetësi false. Kështu kemi qenë.
Në teorinë pse do të ishte një komunist, siç ishin ato 10 sistë komuniste, do të ishte I ndershëm, njëri social, njëri me ideale, njëri energjik, njëri optimist, e të tjera. Të mendoj një të kisha sfidare, dhe mund të tëra këto I kisha, sepse I kam edhe tani. Më duke që dhe sot për këtë punoj. Që shoqëria të bëhet sa më sociale, që t'jetë sa me ndjeshme nda individi dhe tërësia individit përbën komunitetin.
Gjithaj optimizmi dhe vruri që shojmë në të materialet e vjetra, të arkivat, ka qenë I vërtet gjithë?
Jo, më thënë që mund të flasë me një eksperiencë fare të vërtet, që janë aksionet e rinis, ku kemi punuar, kur kemi ndërtuar taracat me agrume të Bregdetit, kur kemi ndërtuar rrugën Malësis Madhe, kur kemi ndërtuar Hekurudhën. Me ishte vërtet mërëve, sepse ndërtonje ka entuziazm, që s'është entuziazm bile prej gjenjeshtër, ose do thosha shumë histeri. Entuziazmet frenetike të kongreseve, të ceremonira, ato janë entuziazmet të komanduara, të kontrolluara. Bile ato si janë entuziazme, sepse s'ka vlerë, ato janë histerira të turmës. Historia të turmës para një lideri, si para një ikonës, se sa më larg ishte turma nga udhëheqësi, aq më shumë udhëheqësi bëhej mit. Kur udhëheqësit I afroheshe, shikonje nga ama afër, sa më shumë I afroheshe, aq më shumë çmitizohej, aq më shumë zhleftësohej.
Mami, thuaj të shqetëson, për filmin që ka
Nuk e di. Si po të kërkes të ma bënda jo djalim, po një tjetër nuk e di edhe të bënja, duhet të mendoj. Dhe duhet të jem ndarë, nuk të jap do të një përgjigje. Në raport me të time nuk më shqetëson, sepse po themi një gjë që është një realitet, po them raportin tim me këtë realitet, I takon të kaluarës, po Është presente në të tashmë.
E l'Albania appare sull'orlo della guerra civile. Carri armati sono in marcia verso il sud del paese, dove molte città sono nelle mani dei rivoltosi armati. E il probabile obiettivo è Valona, teatro negli ultimi giorni degli scontri più cruenti e dove nelle ultime ore si sono avuti altri 2 morti. Nel primo giorno di stato di emergenza il Parlamento ha confermato Sali Beriscia per altri 5 anni alla carica di Presidente della Repubblica. Intanto gli albanesi si preparano alla prima notte di coprifuoco dalla Seconda Guerra Mondiale.
Leur argent a disparu dans la faillite de la société locale de crédit pyramidal et ce sont eux qui menaient la révolte des cotisés par nous. À l'hôpital, on ne savait plus où donner de la tête ni comment soigner les victimes de bastonnades ou de balles perdues.
Kam frikë nga ardhja se nuk po shoh zgjidhje. Ose unë nuk arrit të kuptoj strategjinë që po ndërtohet. Kam frikë. Jam e paqartë. Kur flas për të ardhmen, flas për gjërat konkrete që janë rreth meje. Flas edhe për të rëndin. Vrau shumë gjëra kjo që ndodhi në 97-ën. Duket sikur ka një fuqi shkatruese, do të ketë një fuqi ndërtuese. Kam frikë. Dhe për vetë edhe për ty. Gjë më e rëndësishme për mua tani në jetë është një ardhme për ty dhe për Evicin. Kjo më duket shumë dëshirë shumë e madhe. Po kaq e bukur është dhe dëshira që të ketë një të ardhme për të Shqipërinë. Kjo ka një logjik në mes, sepse unë nuk ju shoh ju të dy të shkëputur nga vendi, kështu që është një dëshirë logjike, që nëse ky vend do ketë një të ardhme dhe ju do keni një të ardhme, nëse ky vend nuk ka të ardhme dhe ju s'keni për të ardhme, kështu që është nga ato që themin në Shqipëri që synon një gjë dhe i ke të dyja. Që ne ju transmetuam dyshimin në kuptimin që të vërtetën duhet ta bësh në provë.
Vamos a empezar con unas cuantas preguntas aquí a la mesa, Robert y Pablo, para luego abrir el diálogo un poco más amplio, integrar a Marina también, y me parece que bueno, al final Pablo quiere hacer como sacar algunas conclusiones sobre el simposio.
Gracias. Yo quería pedirle a Paulo Herkenhoff si pudiera ser un poco más explícito y también, por tanto, también más puntual en describir esta situación respecto a la complicación de que la intervención curatorial externa pudiera ser conservadora internamente. Y desgraciadamente, bueno, también de una manera como, sé que puede ser complicado, pero como describiéndonos más el caso que de Guy Brett, porque sentí que en cierta manera yo me siento un poco incómodo con la generalidad de tu descripción y también el no tener muy en claro qué clase de condiciones y discusión podemos lanzar sobre casos específicos contemporáneos. Gracias.
I do want to displace the discussion from Guy Brett because I always think of him from the best moments. But arriving in Brazil and making alliance in the late 80s and 90s with Gabinete de Arte, Raquel Arnaud, the dealer, the Sérgio Camargo, and certain Greenbergian curators who have been in the last decade discussing, like Rodrigo Naves, who dares to consider Clark and Oiticica as official artists because they were focused on the Biennale, which is a private institution. No? It's a group which for the last 20 years have managed to be in certain positions at the university in São Paulo and Rio, and in a way managing a certain discourse for the market in the institutional level. So when he approached, for instance, an artist like Papi, maybe it's too late, no? Because until a certain moment, Papi was not authorized by Camargo as a good artist. So for a period he left her aside. So there is a ruling of who you can talk about and not. And I feel that the Greenbergians in the last 15 years, they have been very much involved in a deconstruction of a certain Brazilian history before it's even written, before it's even set a symbolic place. So it's like substituting the country from its tradition for a theory. And it's very interesting because if you take, for instance, what was the 50s and the 60s in Brazil, the role that phenomenology played in neoconcretism since the late 40s, because a writer like Pedrosa, he studied Viscasire, he was very interested in Freud, Prince Horn, and he met the surrealists in Paris, but he understood surrealism was not the issue for Brazil. The issue was to discuss the idea of the individuality, the subjectivity in the form, to rescue the subject in the tradition, the concretist tradition. And of course, he was a Trotskyist and believed of this contamination of life and art. And at the same time, being a Freudian, for instance, he was able to dialogue with a Jungian psychiatrist who was doing social psychiatry with poor people and bringing the artists also inside the mental hospital, or the mental psychiatric institution. So there is this tradition in Brazil, which is the dialogue between the friction of life, the friction of subjectivity, this friction of social difference in a very immobile class society, no? And at the same time, this condemnation to modernity. So this friction between rationality and life is what enriched, I think, Brazilian life in the last century. and at the same time to bring Greenberg, I think it's against the current. I feel, for instance, in the United States, the amount of literature that you have today in the United States, great, thesis on Merleau-Ponty, it indicates there is a growing intellectual, genuine interest. So Brazil is in the counter-current, rescuing Greenberg against what has been our tradition in favor of very specific artists. But Camargo is a very specific issue because he's a latecomer to the concretist discourse. So to have him as a guide and his group as a guide is actually to distort and to distort what has happened. And so I feel that historically there is this gap, for instance, between an artist like Cildo Meirelles and a critic like Ronaldo Brito, which is, we cannot discuss Brazilian art departing from Cézanne. I mean, it's no longer. I mean, the Biennale of Porto Alegre, which is the Mercosul Biennale, the departed point is Cézanne, as if Cézanne could give an account of what's happening today as far as space is concerned in Brazil. Space in Brazil nowadays is both the space in the web, but it's mostly the social space, the social limits, the social border, so how to cross. So I feel that in a way, there is, of course, a great intellectual level among those writers, but I think they are just in the process of dismantling a tradition, like willing to dismantle, like with Sick and Clark.
I could just add to that, that Greenbergianism in general, in its home country, is equally large as a problem, has created institutions at least as powerful on the academic side of the equation as any museum institutional opinion could be, and very often the two have overlapped. And that Greenberg was a brilliant but extremely prejudicial thinker, and that deconstructing Greenberg is one of the principal projects of, if you will, contemporary writing, which is not to say not to regard him as a serious contender, but to get over the idea that if you just tinker with the model, you can overcome its deficits. Undoing Greenberg from the beginning and asking as a cultural phenomenon why he occurred and what he served is as important as taking anything apart that I can think of.
Así. ¿Podemos esperar un poco para darle nada más continuidad un poco a esta conversación y ahorita? ¿Sí?
Well, I have one question for Mr. Storr and one comment, if I may, to Paulo. The question is that I thought your talk was extremely pointed and very interesting. But I was wondering, in the list of, it's about limits, I would like to ask a question. In the list of artists that you mentioned, you didn't mention one that we know that has done a lot of work on the Holocaust, for example, is Boltanski. And I was wondering if that was in purpose, and if you would agree with Daniel Buren, who characterized the work of Boltanski as being the Holocaust redesigned by Pierre Cardin. And if you think so, why? And if you do not, why too?
Artists say such nice things about each other. No, I do not believe that. I am not an unqualified fan of Boltanski. I think some of his work is to be taken very seriously. Some of it is, I think, repetitive and over-aestheticized. Many artists have, crucial moments where they seize upon something. How they then develop it varies a great deal. I think it would be a terrible mistake to take late Boltanski and use it against early Boltanski. I think part of what interests me in Boltanski is his bad boy humor at the beginning and the increasing gravity of his work in the end of the beginning, in the beginning of the middle, if you want to call it that. I left him out because I have multiple examples. I mean, I could bore you all for hours. ours, but it was not an explicit exclusion, no.
No, but my question was more about, do you see some limits and the difficulty to actually represent and talk about this type of history in a sense? I mean, that's what the question is. And where can you actually talk about that type of history in the structure of the museum? That's pretty much my question.
In many structures, but let me. This may not satisfy you, but it's, I think, aimed at least at part of the question. If part of the question is that Boltanski over-aestheticizes a subject matter which is not in the least aesthetic, that if you take seriously Adorno's famous remark about there being no poetry after Auschwitz, if you take it seriously and you remember that Paul Celan, in fact, wrote beautiful, beautiful lyric poetry after Auschwitz and about Auschwitz, you realize that there's a built-in tension, and the tension has not to do with the aestheticization for a particular taste or a particular social need, like, buying things or admiring things for their pure aesthetic values. It is that the aesthetic itself is a means of communication. One of the liabilities, it seems to me, of hardcore conceptualism of the 1960s variety, much of which I admire on its own terms, but I see limitations as a permanent model for political art, is that it removes the possibility of aestheticizing anything and creates an aesthetic of withdrawal, withholding, puritanism, etc., etc. That Boltanski, like many others, are people who ventured into the extremely marshy territory of dealing with the beauty of things that are inherently horrifying. And I would turn it around and then go back to Felix, who I think is an absolutely pivotal figure in American, North American, I think international art of this generation. And Felix, educated, if you will, in the world of Kossuth, who, by the way, has also become more aesthetic, but educated in the world of Kossuth, of simple declarative statements in hard type, so to speak, understood that seduction was a way to get past the defense mechanisms that were already established, and also past the supreme indifference of people who were, in a sense, not attracted to things that didn't seem to want them. Barth wrote a great text in The Pleasure of the Text where he says, "For me to read a text, the text must desire me." So much of critical art has thought, no, you come to me and then I will tell you what you need to know, which is a very kind of pedantic, and also, by the way, masterful position to take in relation to the viewer. But the idea that the text can express a desire for the reader is already aesthetic. And what Felix did was to say, I know what the costs of this are, but I also know that you catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. And you can always add vinegar to the honey, so they go for the candy, but they get something that's not sweet.
¿Alguna pregunta para Marina?
¿Pueden apagar la luz? ¿O
pueden subir la luz?
Prenderlo.
Y apagarla de allá.
No, realmente es una pregunta para Marina porque, tengo que irme y tengo que preguntarle ahora. Primero, dobrodošla, Marina. Y segundo, quisiera saber qué implicaciones tuvo la vivencia del socialismo y realmente socialismo versus cuerpo. Y qué implicaciones tuvo en tu trabajo. Todo lo que hemos vivido ahí, ¿no? Titoísmo, pioneros, todo. Específicamente en cuerpo de la mujer, tal vez.
Yeah, okay. I understood the question, I think. First of all, for me it was very important that my work was born in communist and socialist environment. I think it was very essential because I really need limits in order to break them. And I never felt any restriction as a being woman artist. I never even had any idea to be part of any feminist movement. I never felt feminist because my mother was, the major of the army, and all the women in Yugoslavia had really the major function in building the new socialist country. So I always was a kind of feeling like just equal or even more powerful than any man artist there. For me, the difficulty starts was when I left Yugoslavia and I went to Amsterdam, and I went in Amsterdam in time when in '75 when actually everything was too free. So the entire work and building restrictions and breaking them didn't have any sense sense anymore, because I just, didn't make sense there, because it was no point. So in order to continue my work, I have to build my own restrictions over and over again. Thank you.
I would like to add something to Marina. I was born in a capitalist society, and I saw artists being tortured, artworks being seized, exhibitions being closed, curators being set into prison. I can't call this a military dictatorship if we are speaking about economic systems. So I think today the island of Cuba is entirely a place of no democracy, no freedom in a way, But in a side of this place, people still has a possibility to discuss and produce art. In a very tiny part, people is being tortured without the right to be assisted by a lawyer, by the families. So I feel the island of Cuba is in a way today, it presents what we are living, which is the lack of social thought. This doubt now is not the Montaigne's doubt, which fosters knowledge, but it's a doubt of an extreme anger, an extreme anguish. I think this is the limit. I feel in a way that living in the United States, for me, it's an amazing experience because the contradiction is so strong in a country which is really open and which is in a way democratic. At the same time, when I saw this fantastic film, 50 years of the Soviet regime, let's say, at the same time I'm thinking that now 30 years, Brazil is still discussing whether we are not opening the archives of the dictatorship, the torture, etc. A lot will come from that. The classified archives from CIA are also classified for 50 years. So
I'd just like to add something. I would like to see somebody make a film like that of a young Republican militant after this last convention plus 20 years.
Mi nombre es Rafael Armenta de la Academia de San Carlos, maestro de la Escuela de Artes Plásticas en la UAM. Mi pregunta es para Pablo. ¿Por qué, para referirse al trabajo curatorial y su carácter cíclico, utiliza el pensador italiano Gramsci, sobre todo que sus planteamientos ahora están muy desprestigiados entre el vulgo?
No, I took this idea that independence is something very relative and that you have to be aware of. It's when I discuss this idea that sometimes we speak about the autonomous intellectual who see himself or herself as autonomous, and at the same time this person is engaged in what is the power structure. Of course, a film like this, again, it's how ideology is ideologically treated. What's ideology? Seems always to be the other's thought. I don't think Gramsci is totally out of fashion, and I don't think intellectually things should be discussed as outmoded. What I feel is, of course, the social basis, the economic basis have changed totally. Maybe he does not give any longer an account to what we live today. I wanted to have voted. 77% of the Brazilians are against Bush. I wanted to vote in that election because that affects my country, etc. So, of course, today societies are no longer can no longer be discussed into national economies. But of of course, the September 11th at least says that we have to come back to certain notions, for instance, like globalization, speak about the absence of boundaries, and the boundaries were established so strongly. But mainly I used Gramsci for this aspect, and especially because in the 50s, the most dense intellectual discussion in Brazil as far as art was concerned was between a Trotskyist, Pedrosa and his group, and a Gramscian, Cordeiro from São Paulo. And Cordeiro, he was Brazilian, but born in Rome and lived in Rome during the war. Of course, he had this impact. So Cordeiro responded with a very strong formalist perspective, rescuing, for instance, people who work in factories to make fabrics as artists, because he wanted to create a model of the organic artist. So for me, I feel it's the Gramscian there comes from this idea of a certain level of engagement. It was part of my talk to discuss about the critic as a social agent and the artist also as a social agent, but bringing this to the complex reality of Brazil today, which are the favelas, and illustrating with artists who are working with the favelas nowadays. No? And in their ethical question is about authorship, the economic results of labor when you deal with community, and how it's not only paying people to be figuration like in a film, but what kind of authorship do you do, how do you follow with that? So it's a new issue, but I still think that it's the organic is still a model for me.
Can I add one thing too in terms of Gramsci and in terms of the whole idea of what the hegemonic intellectual is? I've entered into this debate with some other people of my generation, how ironic it is that people who were part of the student revolts or critiques of the 1960s now find themselves in universities remarkably uncritical, not of the society outside the university, but of the university itself. And they have become, in effect, hegemonic, intellectuals, and they direct appropriate challenges in the world beyond, but very few challenges to the institutions that they serve. And I think that's a case where a Gramscian analysis is not to debunk their status, and it is not to tear down the universities, but to understand that the whole system is a series of interconnecting vectors of this kind, and that the university actually is ripe for re-examination on precisely these grounds. And that the discourses that we have, in as much as they challenge certain things, also protect other values underneath the surface. And it's time to have that discussion in a more open way. And I think generally, I would say people who work in the netherland that the curatorial world is, where we are between big capital and the mass audience, we can perhaps be helpful because we are forced to be candid about our compromises.
Nos quedan nada más unos cuantos minutos, entonces tomaremos una última pregunta, y luego le quisiera pedirle a los ponentes que están con nosotros en el simposio que nos acompañen en hacer alguna conclusión, algún comentario, el que quieran hacer. Creo que sería lo mejor para terminar. ¿Cuál es la última pregunta que tenemos por allí? ¿No?
Se ve uno por allá, ¿no? Bueno. Sí, y bueno, la película que a mí se me hubiera ocurrido para Pablo sería la de Francisco Julião, por ejemplo, que es un líder masa, en un momento especial en que las bienales empiezan a tener un gran auge en el arte y en lo que podríamos llamar ciertos eventos norteamericanos de happenings, en donde esta masa no es concurrida autogestiva, ¿no? En este sentido de Francisco Julião. Una película de él yo creo que sería la clave para poder ver ese líder campesino, ¿no? Salido exactamente tal vez de algo que Gramsci ni siquiera se le hubiera ocurrido en ese momento, puesto que él es de gabinete, aunque yo digo en la cárcel no se puede escribir muchas cosas, ¿no? pero sí entender este asunto de rebeldía, ¿no? Life le da un número y en él deja ya intervenir a ese líder raro, ¿no? Se soltarán guerrillas, se soltarán un montón de rebeliones increíbles para cambiar el pensamiento contra la guerra, ¿no? Es decir, la CIA siempre su componente es la guerra a favor de otra guerra y así en caminos. Es decir, el problema de la cultura es ese debate constante, ¿no? Y este líder se me hace raro, ¿no?
Sí, I think Francisco Julião with the campesino leagues, no, is just one of the radical movements towards the change that are needed in Brazilian society. We do understand that Brazil is one of the highest levels in the world of social differences. I think in the Americas it's only Haiti who has a worse situation. So, of course, when artists see these, no matter what are their orientations, they are not in favor. I don't think every artist should be commenting or describing or in a way criticizing this social reality. But I think there is a room for those who want, or for those who feel it's part of their reality. And I would like to quote an artist from the 80s and 90s, Leon Nilsson, who said that truths, there are so many, no? And there is a writer, Brazilian writer who was born in Ukraine, Clarice Lispector. She is from the 4th generation, which is known for a dislocation from modernism, nationalist, regionalist literature towards a more subjective discourse. But still, when she describes the police killing a bandit, no, and this man was killed by 13 shots, and she describes the first shot, she's heard just a child crying, and she did not care about. Then she grows in tension about describing each of the 12 shots, no, and then in the end she finds this man that's dead, holding a picture of someone that was beloved. He was the most wanted criminal, but society did not hear his cry, and he was a child. And she says that we can build only a house when we build the ground. No? And I do think building the ground is a social task in which artists of all orientation are needed. What I don't agree is a destruction of certain experience on just an intellectual level. I liked very much the questioning of Gramsci. This will bring me back to him to see whether I'm right or wrong. What I can say that until now, that was a model which which solved in a way some of my anguishes as a curator. No?
Que terminar, el teatro se tiene que cerrar. Solo quisiera dar un último comentario como conclusión. Creo que el video de Henry Sala resultó ser interesante como comentario en el sentido de que conecta con los temas que comenzamos a tratar desde la primera sesión. ¿No me oyen? Bueno, no, lo siento, no es posible ya. No, lo sentimos, nos tenemos que ir en 5 minutos y podemos hacerlas afuera. Lo único que quiero decir es que el tema de la relación con la política y el arte ha sido continuo desde la primera sesión, nuestra conversación con Shirin Eshat, la conversación con Has Hake y finalmente los comentarios de otros artistas como Tania Bruguera y Marina Abramovich. Creo que es importante recordar todo lo que ellos mencionaron, lo que hemos dicho acerca de la crítica a la historia y sobre todo este último comentario de Marina de la importancia de vivir en el presente con el comentario adicional de Robert Storr, que es vivir con el presente, pero pero con el pasado, ¿no? Con el pasado y no en el pasado, sin el presente. Muchas gracias a todos ustedes, a todos los ponentes por haber participado en este SITAC y esperamos verlos el año que viene. Muchas gracias.